Welcome to the Peace Building Podcast. Join host Susan Coleman as she interviews today's most creative, courageous, and sometimes outrageous mediators, coaches, entrepreneurs, and out-of-the-box thinkers whose work, whether intended or not, is building peace. Tune in for 45 minutes of pure inspiration as we explore the best stories, the best practices, the best ideas of a new world emerging. Here's your host, global consultant, coach, facilitator, and mediator, Susan Coleman. So, Andrea, it's really great to have you here. You have been such an incredible, you've been sort of an instigator for an awful lot of people's work, many of whom have already been on this podcast. Zach Metz, who is in episode 8, Aldo Civico, who's coming up, Gay Rosenblum Kumar, who I know you do a lot of work with or have worked with over the years. And then, of course, me, I think about that situation with the Kurds in 2001, whenever it was. And, it was your courage that was behind all of that. And I'm sure there's just countless of other examples that I know nothing about of the ways that you've set people up to do really interesting work in the peace building, peacemaking field of diplomacy. So I have with me an incredibly brave and intelligent and collaborative soul, Andrea Bartoli.
Thank you.
And I'll just say a little bit about you. You know, I'm obviously going to put your bio up along with the podcast, but this is at the moment. Dr. Bartoli is at the Seton Hall, the School of Diplomacy and International Relations. He's the dean there, and he's an international conflict resolution expert. He has been at Seton Hall since 2013. Before that, he was at George Mason University University School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. Where I came to know you was at SIPA, the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. And then I'm just going to pull out a couple of other things. I mean, there's so many things on this bio. I recommend to people to take a look at it. But you have worked for 2 decades on 4 continents, and you've served as the permanent representative of the community of San Egidio at the United Nations, and maybe you could say a little bit about that if you want to. I'm going to give you in a second some space to do that. But you've worked in numerous peacemaking and peacemaking processes, including Mozambique, Guatemala, Algeria, Kosovo, Burundi, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, et cetera, and then in Burma, Myanmar, in East Timor, in Colombia, in the African Great Lakes region. It just goes on and on. It's really a very impressive bio. And you're from Italy originally, right?
I am.
Yeah.
I was born in Rome and definitely very Italian, as my accent reveals.
Yes. You poor soul. What a terrible place to be born.
Happy to be.
So, what I was interested in really is asking you, like, of all these things that you have done, what stands out to you as parts of this professional bio that have been the most formative to you?
So I would say that certainly is Mozambique. The experience in Mozambique is the most formative one, is the most important one, in many ways the model of anything that I've done afterwards. And it's very important for the listener to realize that in the Mozambique peace process, I was just one little piece of a much larger process that was clearly led by the Mozambicans themselves, who decided to ask the community of Sant'Egidio to mediate a 16 years civil war to its end. So as a young member of the community of Sant'Egidio, I ended up serving the community mediation team in its relationship with the United Nations and the United States. Came to New York several times, was asked to launch and staff and run the office of the Committee of Sant'Egidio in New York so that we could monitor the implementation of the peace agreement that we were negotiating in Rome. And then from that vantage point started this reflection on the Mozambique peace process, on peace processes in general, on peacemaking, and so on. So I think that it's very important to realize that between 1990 and 92 is when all this happened, 2 years and a half of the negotiation of the Mozambican delegation in Rome. And after that, after my coming to the United States, there is this flourishing of Andrea as somebody that has something to say about peacemaking, about the field, about conflict resolution, and so on.
So you grew a lot in that process.
Absolutely. And I think that the field grew through the process too, because we need to realize that when Sant'Egidio got into the Mozambique peace process, we didn't have any knowledge of the field before. So the community of Sant'Egidio was, and is still, a spiritual community.
I was going to ask you what it is exactly, so that people could understand what it is.
Yeah, so the community of Sant'Egidio is a spiritual community of friends living the gospel in service to the poor and working for peace. Pope Francis, visiting the community recently, said, "You are all about prayer, poor, and peace." And the 3P, that became so relevant for us, were a gift of these almost 50 years of life together. The person that started the community is Andrea Riccardi. He started the community in 1968. I joined in 1970. So I've been with the community more than 45 years. Mm-hmm. And the community is not a conflict resolution organization per se. It's an organization that simply invites people to take their interiority seriously, their responsibility seriously.
It takes the what? The
interiority.
The interior life?
Interior life,
okay.
Yeah. Their interior life seriously, and their responsibility towards others, towards the poor especially, so that many expressions of this vocation, of this way of living, found themselves in areas that have been tremendously relevant and important. So the community has been at the forefront of work against the death penalty. It's been in the forefront on the work for registration of birth, for kids all over the world to be registered when they are born rather than neglected or abandoned. In many countries you have a large percentage of kids that are never recorded. You don't know that they are born. We had significant work done against HIV/AIDS, especially with mother-to-child transmission and things of this sort. But peace was one of the areas where the community became relevant, encountering the need for peace. So I think it's a very important realization, because in many ways you have a becoming, you have a development, you have a movement from potentiality to actuality that comes when you encounter a challenge and you say, okay, what do I do in front of this?
And it was the Mozambique experience? Yeah.
Exactly. Before that, we had some other moments and occasions. Prior to Mozambique, for example, we had a very important encounter with the crisis in Lebanon, in the Bekaa, and Christian's family were dislodged, and the community organized some talks between the leader of the Druze, Jumbalad, and the patriarch of the Melkite Church, Maximus V. So the beginning was really the response to a need of somebody. And the construct for us that was the most important one was friendship. The person that was asking was a friend in need. The friendship allowed for the articulation of the need that provided in a way an invitation, an implicit invitation, but also the space for a creative response that was not just boxed by professional, pre-cooked responses, but rather a creative, responsible, articulated one. Mm-hmm. So in similar ways, in the Bekaa with Jumbalat, or in Mozambique with this Archbishop of Beira, who was previously to his appointment just a friend of the community. He was a Mozambican priest in Rome studying, and he became suddenly one of the few black Mozambican native priests that could be considered for the priesthood when in Lisbon a leftist military coup led towards a decolonization process that was very hastily done. And the church had the possibility of changing a century-old policy of having only white Portuguese bishop in the colonies to a post-Vatican II policy of having black, native, African bishop in an African country. Mm-hmm. So this friend that was a priest became a bishop, and going back to Mozambique in the second half of the 70s, realized that it was not easy to be a Catholic in Mozambique at that time. It was actually very difficult because the power at that point was transferred to Frelimo, and Frelimo.
And what was that? Are you
was
say
the Frente de Liberação de Mozambique, a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla movement that had both political and military structures, and was clearly very close to Moscow and the communist Soviet bloc, and was very suspicious of not only religious group in general because of ideological posturing, but also Catholic in particular because of the connection to the former colonial power. Mm-hmm. Portugal was clearly not a welcoming, easy partner for Mozambique at that time. So the Archbishop of Beira had significant difficulties in his first few years in his dioceses. He couldn't celebrate Mass, he couldn't move, he had restrictions on his movement, was put in jail a couple of times. And when he came to Rome for the Visit ad Limina, the Visit ad Limina is something that every Catholic bishop must do in person to meet the Pope every 7 years. It used to be 5 years before. He not only visited the Pope and the Curia and the Vatican, but also came to Sant'Egidio and visited the old friends of Sant'Egidio. Now, this is clearly already a very different meeting. This is not the old priest that used to come with us. It's not just a friend that used to come. He's somebody else. And yet is somebody else who is in need. He has a specific need because his people are encountering restriction in their religious freedom. And so Sant'Egidio responds clearly by welcoming him, by giving him the floor, by allowing him to speak. And the way Jaime Gonzalez, this is the name of the Archbishop, explaining at Harvard a few years ago, what happened at that night, he said, I opened my sorrowful soul to them. So there is this moment in which he's simply saying, this is my life, this is what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. I cannot celebrate Mass, I was put in jail, I cannot move, this is my difficulty. And the response of the community was very interesting because it was not only we embrace you, it was not only we give you what we have, a little money, some medicine, some food, but also we will accompany you. We will walk with you seeking something better for you. And we didn't really have a sense of what that better could look like. We were not thinking about peace. We were not thinking about peacemaking. We were not thinking about anything. We were simply wanting to help a friend. And the friendship was clearly creating the conditions for two fundamental responses. One, a creative response, an intelligent creative response, and the other one, a responsible response. So you have a community that in a way becomes attentive to the need of one person, and through one person encounter a much larger human system. That is, everybody else in Mozambique, especially the Catholic, especially the poor, especially the ones that are victimized.
And what was can you set the stage a little bit about what was going on in Mozambique at that moment?
So at that moment, what was happening is that the Frelimo government was getting into a very vicious hardening of the human system, because they were trying to create a nation state out of a population and a territory that was never a country together before. So you don't have Mozambique before and then after. There was simply no Mozambique. Mozambique was a colonial controlled territory of Portugal. It was not a country. It was not an independent country. It didn't have any form of self-governance. So Frelimo was clearly building that nation, and building that nation on the background of an extraordinary, ethnic difference, linguistic difference, cultural differences. There is no one single ethnic group in Mozambique that in a way identify with Mozambique as such. And this effort led them to choose a highly centralized structure. And that meant that people at the periphery, people at the local level felt very much that this centralized structure was too much, that was not welcome, that there were too many layers of control, and that traditional structure actually had to be respected. And so you have fixture and you have fractures, within the emergent Mozambique system, and some dissatisfaction is expressed within the Frelimo groups, especially among people that have a higher appreciation for traditional structures. And so Mozambique enters into this paradoxical looping of contradictions that are self-reinforcing, in which the government wanted to unify the country and therefore, proposes a centralized structure. The centralized structure marginalize local actors, disempower traditional actors, and the traditional actors and the local actors actually move away even further from the central administration. Central administration start calling them enemies and adversaries and so on, and then start having violent response, trying to control the system, and vice versa. The opponent becomes active enemies, and then start, the Renamo process.
Renamo standing for what?
For Resistenza Nacional Mozambicana.
So it's the resistance movement.
It's a resistance movement against the Frelimo control, centralized project. And obviously, White Rhodesia, South Africa, super happy, to mess around into Mozambique internal affairs and support Renamo against Frelimo. And so you have a split of the country, and fairly soon you have a significant civil war. So you have a process that is starting of a country coming together, and at the same time you have a significant response that is terribly violent and terribly disruptive and terribly taxing for the people. You have almost 1 million deaths in 16 years. It's a very, very bloody war, and is a terribly destructive experience. But when Jaime was speaking, we were at the beginning of this. And so it was a moment in which the split was happening, and it was not even completed at that point. And what the community decided to do was to help the church to gain some space in terms of its religious freedom. So for 10 years, the community of Sant'Egidio actually worked with Jaime Gonzalez and the other bishop of Mozambique to simply care for the religious space, for the religious freedom space, to make sure that the government understood the importance of keeping the church alive, to keeping the church part of the nascent Mozambican state, and to allow for diplomatic relationship between Mozambique and the Vatican, and to allow for an evolution of Mozambique as a country that could represent the population as a whole. So this is This is Sant'Egidio. Sant'Egidio is a group of friends responding to the request of a friend.
So this was a situation where you ultimately, Sant'Egidio, ultimately became essentially the mediator of Renamo and Frelimo.
Exactly,
right?
And they asked us to do so.
How did that come to be? It seems like an unlikely neutral to come into that situation.
So, first of all, the important things to understand is that neither party wanted to have someone else. That is to say, there was a mutual opposition. Renamo clearly wanted to have the UN mediate. They wanted to have major powerful actor to mediate. But Frelimo was adamant that this was an internal conflict and there was a legitimate government and there was no way that any international actors could play a role. Mm-hmm. They tried regional proxy negotiation with Kenya representing Renamo and Zimbabwe representing Frelimo, but that didn't work. So there was very clearly a need for direct talk. And so Sant'Egidio was a very clever solution on their part so that they could have enough international oversight that Renamo could feel safe, but enough deniability so that the government could say, well, but this is just an NGO. Nobody.
International oversight simply because it was Italian.
It was Italian. Mm-hmm. It was connected to the Vatican, mm-hmm. to the Italian government. It had some capacity to representation to the UN. So it already had some degree of internationalization that was enough for Renamo to engage. And in that sense, it's certainly true that it was a Mozambican choice that Sant'Egidio encouraged, that Sant'Egidio welcomed, but it was definitely an innovation.
Yeah, so what do you think was the presence, when you look back on that experience, did it feel successful? Was it successful? What was the presence that you brought ultimately that allowed you to bring those sides together? Do you feel like it was the catalyst that ended the Civil War? Would you be able to say that?
Absolutely, with no doubt whatsoever. I think that, and it is to the credit of the Mozambicans themselves that spent 2.5 years in Rome negotiating. And the Sant'Egidio team was clearly helping them to come to terms with the need to really establish Mozambique as a constitutional country, as a country that was in many ways negotiated. So there was a constitutional quality to the talks in Rome that was very, very palpable. And in many ways you can say that Mozambique is a great success, but still you must say that is a success in the making. Mozambique is now actually confronting the possibility of a new civil war, of a new violence, of a renewed tension. And I think that think back at the experience in Rome is extraordinarily important because Rome was the proof that lasting state building requires political ingenuity, requires political creativity, requires an investment that is constitutional in nature, that allows for the representation of the interest of all. Sant'Egidio was clearly able to serve that process and beyond, and has been present in Mozambique all these years and continued to be very committed to Mozambique, very concerned about Mozambique, always in touch with everybody. But in many ways, you see in the Mozambique case the primacy of politics in the highest sense, of the capacity of humans to come together through the representation of interests and needs, and the capacity to build political institutions that have these tasks, these functions of representing interests and needs over time.
So, and maybe you already have, but what would you say was the real learning that you had as an intermediary
So the first thing is that peace is always possible. And this must be repeated over and over again in many, many, many difficult situations where you do not see the possibility of peace. But Mozambique encountered, struggled with the possibility of peace after 1 million deaths on a population of 10 million people. So you have a tenth of the population dead. You have an incredible mass disruption. You have 5 million refugees and internally displaced people, half of the population outside the country. And in those conditions, you are able to imagine peace. So if that was possible in Mozambique, I say, it's possible in Syria, it's possible in Afghanistan, it's possible anywhere. So I think.
And what did you do, Andrea, yourself personally to send that message? Do you remember holding that message? What actually happened?
So the first things that was very important in that process was actually the use by the founder of the Community of Sant'Egidio, Andrea Riccardi, in his opening remark of a line by Pope John the 23rd that says, "Seek what unites, not what divides." It's a very simple rule. It's a very simple discipline. Seek what unites, not what divides. And that simple sentence ended up in the joint communicate. I'll be happy to send you a copy of the joint communicate signed in Portuguese by all the members of the team. Wonderful. And you see this in the document. And this becomes an ethos. So this becomes a guiding driver of the talks. So peace is not only possible, but peace requires a certain discipline. Peace requires a method. And the method is I need to self-control myself. I need to make a choice. I can make that choice. And the choice is I want to seek what unites, not what divides. I know that I can divide. I know that I can seek what divides. I know that after 1 million deaths and 5 million refugees, I can divide very easily. I'm already divided. I can see that division is already operative. But I can actually see the power of reorienting myself towards the possibility that even if remote, is clearly there. And so I think that this reorientation is the fundamental compass that we need to always, always, always have. Is this reminder that it is really like a compass. It doesn't really matter for the compass where you are in the world. The compass is always telling you where the north is, because the field, the magnetic field that, that the Earth has. And so in many ways you can say that humans have this magnetic field internally, and that they can, if they are attentive enough, if they are sensitive enough, intelligent enough, responsible enough, that they can know what unites, that they know if screaming in a meeting is going to unite, if they know if, giving a sign of a shaking hands, is uniting, and so on and so forth. And so I see the process of Mozambique as a 2-year-long process of reorientation of multiple actors. There are these beautiful images that now we have from from nature, telling us how deers decide when it is time to go and drink. And in the past, we thought, there is an alpha deer that decides that this is the right time, and then we all go. And instead, now we know that deers move when one stand up and look towards the water. And then a second one stand up and look towards the water. And then a third one stand up and look towards the water. When 51% of the pack look at the water, everybody moves. And I find that image
almost like the 100th monkey kind of idea.
And I think that is exactly what I felt in Mozambique. You saw one person moving, and then you saw 2 people moving, and then 3, and then 4, and then 5, and then everybody. They signed the agreement. But what was impressive what was impressive, Caroline Nordstrom, an anthropologist, American anthropologist that happened to be in Mozambique when this happened, she said, everybody was silent that day. Everybody was listening to the radio. Everybody was attached to this to hear if it were true that the President Chissano and the chairman of Renamo, Giacomo, were to sign this agreement in Rome. As soon as they heard that this was true, they started dancing in the street. And the country started dancing. Now, I think that people need to hear this, that peace came to Mozambique because people started dancing. Didn't come to Mozambique because the UN came. Didn't come because you had a commission of inquiry. Didn't come. It came because there was a sudden restructuring that was complete and profound and credible and genuine between the leadership and the people. And both the leadership and the people at the same time said, peace has come. We will hold the peace that we are seeking together. We don't know exactly how we are going to divide the government. We don't know how we are going to do the elections. We don't know how we are going to do this and that. But the fundamental reorientation of the country from war to peace came that day.
Seems like there was almost like an intentionality that started with one person and then grew one by one by one.
And I think that this is exactly why I feel that the study of the Mozambique case is so still in the making, so profound. As you know, Peter Coleman sat me down for 2 years to tell the story that I'm now telling you in 45 minutes. And the reason of all those conversations was that he needed to understand how it's possible that human systems that are clearly disruptive, clearly controlled by enmity, clearly controlled by violence, suddenly can restructure so profoundly. And I find that the Mozambique case is just phenomenally fruitful if we pay attention to it. Because as you said, we see the importance of one person at a time. The peace process is not invented. The peace process is very concrete. It's one person, and then another one, and then another one.
Really speaks to the power of each of us to make a decision.
I definitely agree completely. And I think that I'm very grateful to the people that danced that day. You know, at the same time, immediately after, we were looking at what was
I'm not
happening.
sure I get that completely. The decision had already been made, or it was in the air, and then people started dancing, and through their dancing, they were conveying what they wanted.
So what happened was that we were supposed to sign the agreement October 1st, 1992 in Rome. And then there were 3 days of crazy negotiation. Giacomo didn't want to sign anymore. Chissano was there. Nobody knew what happened and so on. It was really very difficult. And then finally on October 4th, the agreement was signed. And so this was announced, one day after, one day. Everybody was sort of there and not there at the same time. It could go in all directions. It could go that this was another failure, that this was actually not the peace that everybody was waiting for, or it could actually be true. So when it did happen and it was broadcast live on the radio from Rome, people believed that this was actually true, that what was happening in Rome was actually the ending of the civil war, the beginning of the peace, the fact that the leaders did come together, and even though they could not be in Rome, everybody was in Rome. The whole Mozambique was in many ways witnessing this moment of peace coming to Mozambique through the signature of the agreement in Rome.
So, Andrea, this really sets you off on a whole professional path.
Absolutely, exactly, because I participate in this and I witnessed this, and so you can, in a way, explain my trajectory as making sense of this coming of peace and empowering people in their desire for peace. So you mentioned at the beginning some of the collaborators that I work with, and I felt very strongly that every time I encounter anybody anywhere in the world that has minimally a desire for peace, a sort of an orientation towards that, seeking what unites, not what divides, that I must strengthen that resolve, that I need to accompany that resolve. And the advantage now is that I have words, I have images, I have stories. I have these wonderful stories that you alluded before about PUK and KDP, the two warring factions in Iraq, Kurdish factions, controlling two different parts of the territory that was snatched away from Saddam Hussein, and yet fighting each other on the ground, and then coming to New York to try to find a way to work together. And I was bold enough to reach out to you and try to see if we could use actually innovative American organizational large group design to facilitate a conversation that I felt could not be held through the modes, through the method that I knew with Sant'Egidio. And you suggested open space that to me was nothing, was just a sound. I didn't know what you had in mind. I didn't know what it was. And I must say that I went into it with great apprehension because I was
did. I always felt like you went in with a great faith, and I was always amazed that you did that.
And I think that was partially because I felt that you need to be bold in order to explore, and you need to offer opportunity for people to explore possibilities that were not available to them. And as you know very well, that session was incredibly fruitful, even and especially because we allowed them to do whatever they wanted, including taking, large space, go shopping, do whatever they wanted for a large amount of time. But the results were extraordinarily powerful because they took responsibility for the result. They took responsibility for the process. They went back. We continued to work with them. In many ways, I would say that really changed the culture of collaboration between PUK and KDP that is still standing today. So I think that the contribution of that particular moment to the experience of what it means to be Kurd in northern Iraq, to what it means to work together in northern Iraq and possibly in Iraq as a whole, it's definitely part of a very important legacy. Now, similar to what happened with the first visit of Jaime to Sant'Egidio in 75, 76, 77, you don't know that these things are so important. You need to do them true to their own moment. There is a truthfulness to the moment. There is a discipline to the moment, which I think is very, very important to all of us. We really need to be careful not to be overambitious or not over-expectant. Oh my God, if I do this, then this will happen, and this will change and happen this and that. But rather be open to the discipline of the moment as it presents itself.
I think that's such an important statement in the sense that people speed up so much, they're looking towards the end versus staying completely present to the what is in the moment to see what emerges. And the more it seems that people are able to do that, manage their anxiety, come back to the present moment, some really important things can emerge if they will allow it.
I agree completely. I think that attentiveness is actually the first step. You really need to be attentive to everybody in the process, attentive to yourself, attentive to what is emergent. Absolutely.
I want to, there's so much to say and so little time, and I wanted to, because you have a perspective. One of the things that really interests me is the use of bringing process innovations into the field of international diplomacy. And in the time that we have left, I'm wondering what you think about that, what you have to say about that. You have a real perspective on the field of diplomacy and what's happening, and what you think is the room for. One of the things that interests me is, there's a lot of wonderful things happening in the field of organization development, and I'm based in that field, and I'm also based in international relations and peace building. And I think there's room for cross-pollination. I think there's room for growth in how peacemaking and peace building is done that is drawing on some of the process innovations that happen in organization development.
I think that you're absolutely right. And I think that we will see more and more hybridization and synergies. So to a certain extent, the use of open space is very clear to me. And I use open space then in conversation with ethnic groups in Myanmar, and now we have a very different scenarios in Myanmar, partially because of the use of those techniques and so on. So I think that there is certainly something there that is very powerful. But if you look at processes like the one that you have been involved directly, that is GAMAC, for example, this global action against mass atrocity crimes, there is no doubt in my mind that a good portion of the success of GAMAC is actually connected directly to the use of facilitated processes, where even the process design is actually part of the innovation. Mm-hmm. So you don't have innovation just on the content side. You don't have innovation only on the activity side. You have innovation on the process. And in this sense, I think that we all need to become much more aware of the importance of process on outcome, and also the capacity for different contributions. You have, for example, now a network of religious and traditional peacemakers emerging. I hope that you will interview Antti Pantikainen, who is the convener of that group. But it's a fascinating process that you see traditional actors playing completely new roles. And you see traditional processes being used in completely different settings. And I think that there is a very, very important role for a person like you that, in a way, is enough in academia, enough into practice to pay attention to what is happening and tell the story of this happening as it happens. So in a way, bring people into this exciting realization that humans actually have been using process for thousands of years, and that there is a lot of material available even at the ethnographic level that we better pay attention to.
Yeah, you have seen from my small corner of the world, you have seemed to be a real champion of process innovations. Do you see others open to it in the field of diplomacy? Do you see, it's a pretty traditional field. It's slow to change, slow to move. What's your perspective on that?
Well, in a way, the Vatican, who has been the oldest diplomacy, was open enough to allow Sant'Egidio to innovate. So I think that there is certainly hope there. But I would say that even more traditional powers, are clearly becoming much more interested in process. I would say that if you look at the investment of the Finns and the Turks into this mediation capacity, the UN itself, with the mediation support unit, they are clearly becoming much, much more process-oriented, process-sophisticated, and so on. So you may have a lot of old-fashioned people that can see the world still only through a lens of power game, but you do have enough of a constituency of people that can imagine things differently. I am always impressed by the creativity of Mo Bleeker, the special envoy of the Swiss government on dealing with the past and genocide prevention, because she has been a tremendous advocate, but also a practitioner of process as it applies to international relations. Mm-hmm. So my sense is that we are going to see more of this as we move along, and part that will be a necessity. I think that it's very difficult to imagine anything of any real value happening in the world today that doesn't have, for example, a coalition form, where states come together, where states and NGO come together, where states, NGO, and international organizations come together. Well, when you have constellation of that kind, process becomes a necessary ingredient of a success. You cannot hold it together unless you have some clarity about the process. And processes can be innovative, processes can be designed in different ways, and so on. But I think that clarity on process will have huge implication on the way we get to outcome. And again, if you look at Paris, for example, if you look at many international negotiation of values, the Sustainable Development Goals, the new goals that we all have now, these are all, clearly the product of processes. Mm. And I think that we need to learn to spell out the promise and challenges of those processes more.
How much does this, you also have been the leader of a number of, well, you're the dean of the School of Diplomacy. You were. I can't remember what your title was at SIPO. It was a dean, or was it also?
I
dean?
was the director, the founding director of the Center for International Conflict Resolution.
Yeah. So, any reflections on the interplay or the relationship between what you've learned in terms of external diplomacy, and then also what you're learning in terms of being the head of complex organizations?
I think that external diplomacy is a very, very important undertaking, and it's a very important function of any state. And I think that we need to realize that it's also a very old one. States have used diplomats and messengers for a long time. What is interesting now is that we can reflect on diplomacy in a way that we couldn't before. As human family, we can see diplomats, we can record diplomats, we can follow diplomats in a way that in the past was just impossible. So we have access to data, we have access to story, we have access to capacity of reconstructing what diplomatic processes look like. And for example, we discovered now that it's very, very, very common to have intelligence community deeply involved in any negotiation of value. It's very difficult for only diplomats to have the exclusivity of any process. You need to have a security dimension. You need to have a defense dimension. You need to bring about actors, even within each state, that do understand what the new process is revealing.
But anything in terms of the relationship between your internal job and
and that's why it's so interesting, is because then obviously you realize that you actually have to have an internal diplomacy. You need to bring the United States government together. You need to bring Italy together. You need to bring the United Nations together. And so, as an academic studying these processes, this is very fertile. Areas of studying diplomacy in the making. Diplomacy needs an emergent nature, the diplomacy as it is happening as we speak.
So, Andrea, in the last few minutes that we have, I wanted to ask you what makes you most hopeful, and also let you say anything else that you'd like, but that's just interesting to me.
I would say people. People make me hopeful because I met people in very difficult situations, and it's always heart-lifting to see them alive, even in those circumstances, and seeking way out, seeking solutions. I really think that the human spirit is much stronger than war, much stronger than violence. I think that violence and war are both mistakes. They are collective mistakes. They are the mistakes of not applying yourself to the discipline of seeking what unites and not what divides. I think that there is a fundamental error in being violent to others, which is clearly a violation of your own humanness, of your own being human. So what gives me hope is really the capacity of people to rediscover themselves as people who are alive and can be better, can be freer. I find the work to bring peace about fascinating, because I find that it's always in the making and never done.
And one of the things about being an intervener in a complex system for me as a process person is I'm always thinking about the compelling vision. Like if you have a compelling vision, you can get there. It's a little bit like what we were talking about, the intention. And around peace, I'm sure you've heard, plenty of people have this association with it as being there's an association of it being boring, potentially. Your vision for, we have so explored as a species what violent conflict looks like, what destructive competition looks like. We haven't really explored what could be in terms of a more peaceful world. And I'm curious about your vision of what that could look like.
I think that there are many communities that try their best and try to have that contribution to a peaceful world. I think that the existence of peaceful human societies is well proven, and there is clearly a significant difference if you are living in Switzerland, in Sweden, or in Somalia. They have all names, but very different quality of life and very different expectation of life and so on. And a lot of that has to do with the capacity of the human system to represent the interest of everybody. Sweden and Switzerland are very diverse. They are not homogeneous societies, and Somali, in many ways, are much more similar than Swiss and Swedes. But I think that the challenge for all of us is to learn from one another and learning from our own experience. I think that Somali actually will need to teach all of us, how you can live together after deep and protracted pain. And I think that we will need to learn from one another how to listen to one another and remember one another's pain once, that moment of war and violence is over.
What did you see in Somalia? What are they teaching? What are they showing us?
Well, I think that there is a perseverance, there is a resilience that is very important. And I think that it is very important for us to remind ourselves that we are never us in isolation. We are always the son of somebody, the daughter of somebody. And I think it's important for us to conquer this collective identity of being human, not necessarily against others, not necessarily against you.
And finally, Andrea, for people that are starting out, that are more young in their careers, for those who are really interested in either being peace builders, process people, anything, how do you think people can best use themselves to create a more peaceful world?
I would say take yourself seriously, locate yourself properly where you are and start really thinking what you can do now, today. You can do a podcast, you can do a research project, you can do an intervention in your school, in your workspace, you can do intervention in your community, you can learn, you can study. There is a lot of things that you can do yourself, and I think that that's the beginning, I would say. The second one is watch out for your capacity for violence, but that may not be apparent to you in your language, in your choices, in the way you do things. And then try to understand the violent one. Never give up on understanding why that person is sad. There is always a reason, and I think it's very, very important to distinguish between understanding and condoning, to really get into the heart and mind of those who are violent. It's a very important discipline, and in many ways is a humbling one, because anyone can be violent, anyone can be made violent, anyone can be made destructive. And I think that if we take ourselves seriously, if we take ourselves, our land, our choices seriously, and we learn from the occasions of violence that we see around us, then suddenly there is a shift in our capacity for learning. Peace must be learned. Peace is not just something that happens. Peace is a choice. Peace is a struggle. It took a while to Mandela, to contribute to peace in South Africa. I think we need to remember that a lot of peacemakers were killed. Isaac Rabin was not, killed by anybody, and Martin Luther King and Anwar Sadat and all that. But I do think that it's important for us to say, do yourself, commit yourself to something long term. And don't be afraid of life commitments. Mm-hmm. Don't be afraid of doing it. Don't necessarily leap into making money or making profit or making a career first. Really have this more as an orientation, an attitude. And then the job and the work and the other things, will work out.
Well, thank you, Andrea. I really appreciate your time, and I hope to. There's a lot of other things that we could have talked about, but I really appreciate hearing more about San Egidio and the whole Mozambique story, because that has it has been a very seminal story, and one that has created an awful lot of other things that has followed. So, thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode of the Peace Building Podcast. Check out the peacebuildingpodcast.com for show notes and for more great information and resources. We like your feedback, comments, and suggestions. Please email them to Susan at thepeacebuildingpodcast.com. And join us again for next week's episode for more great thinking, innovations, and ideas to take our planet to the next level.